So this is the last lecture in the eschatology and for the year. So after this, you just need to make sure that you do this one's exam, and also if there's any other exams that you haven't done or assignments, if there's ones that you need to rewrite, because we've only got a little over a month before graduation. So we need to just start looking at making sure that your average is above 80%. So the final one on eschatology. God's covenant with Israel. In the Old Testament, it refers to Israel as God's wife, but it tells us in Jeremiah 3 verse 30 that she was an unfaithful wife to God. And so Jeremiah 3 verse 8 says that God divorces Israel. Remember, marriage is a covenant as well. So God uses these terms, that he's in a covenant relationship with Israel. It's like a man and a wife, but he divorces Israel because she's unfaithful. She serves other gods. In the New Testament, we see that the church is spoken of as being the bride of Christ. Paul says that the church is betrothed or engaged to Christ. He tells husbands to love their wives just as Christ loved the church. And in Revelation 19, it speaks about the saints being the bride of the Lamb. Now, replacement theology says that the church has permanently replaced Israel, and that's not biblical. They try to say that all the promises given to Israel are fulfilled in the church. God has separate promises for Israel and separate ones for the church. In the new covenant, we have our own promises, but there is still a covenant with Israel and with the Jews that God still is going to keep. So in dispensationalism, which is what we believe in, we believe that there's a distinction between God's program for Israel and for the church. He has separate covenants with Israel and for the church, and we have not replaced Israel. Israel is going to be restored. It makes us very clear in Romans 11, when Paul's writing to the Gentile church, predominantly, he says this. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. He goes on to say, this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So he still speaks of the fact that even though God has a covenant, the new covenant that we're in with the Gentiles of the church, that Israel still is in a covenant relationship with God. We have not replaced Israel. So when does this restoration of Israel start? Well, God has already started restoring Israel. They've got their land back. And God is going to ultimately, in the tribulation, start restoring them spiritually as well. So God has not nullified his promises to Israel. Romans 3 verse 1 to 4 says, what advantage then is there in being a Jew? Much in every way. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. What does he mean by that? It's the Jews, Israel, that gave us the Bible. With the exception of 2 books in the New Testament, Luke and Acts, the whole New Testament was written by Jews. And we know that the Old Testament as well was written by the Jewish prophets. What if some were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every human being a liar. So even though at the moment Israel might be in a state of disobedience to God, God is going to restore them. And those who believe in replacement theology, they have to dismiss all amazing prophecies that we've seen established in the last 100 years, where the state of Israel was again established after thousands of years of not being a country. In 1948, Israel became a nation again. In 1967, after thousands of years of not belonging to the Jews, Jerusalem, the old city, came to belong to the Jews again. Now, Jesus prophesied in his time the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. In Luke 21 verse 24, he said they will fall by the sword and be taken as prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And that's what happened. In AD 70, the temple was destroyed. The Jews were scattered all over the world. But Jesus said, they'll be trampled, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so Israel has once again got Jerusalem back in their hands again. And that tells me we're reaching the end of the age where God is going to start working with Jews again, because Jerusalem has been restored to them. Now, some people are bothered by the fact that the Jews have come back to Israel, but predominantly most of them don't believe in Jesus as a Messiah. Even though they're religious Jews and they'll believe in what we call the Old Testament, and even though God has started restoring them, getting their land back, many of them, or most of them, don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. So why is that? Well, that picture there is a representation of a vision that Ezekiel had. And in Ezekiel 37, he has this vision of a valley of dry bones. And God tells him, prophesy to these dry bones. And he says, these bones are Israel. So we know that those bones represent Israel. So what does Ezekiel do? He prophesies, and the bones come together, but there's still no life in them, no breath in them. And so God commands Ezekiel to prophesy a second time. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them, and they came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. So the first time Ezekiel prophesies, the bones come together, but there's still no life. God tells him to prophesy again, and then they come to life. So we believe that this shows that there's two phases to Israel's restoration. The first part, when those bones come together, that speaks of the land restoration. They'll get their land back. And we've seen this, as I mentioned, in the 20th century. Ezekiel 37 verse 12 says, I will bring you back to the land of Israel. So there's many people who are giving Israel a hard time. I want to tell you that God has a covenant with Israel, and he said to Abram, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And that includes our government, who never support Israel. We put ourselves under the curse of God when we oppose Israel, because in Ezekiel 37 verse 12, God says, I will bring you back to the land of Israel. God has given them that land in a covenant relationship. Ezekiel 36 verse 28, you will live in the land I gave your forefathers. That is the land of Israel. It is theirs based on a promise by God. And if you fight against that, you'll find yourself fighting against God. But what still has to happen is that second part of Ezekiel's vision, where they have to be spiritually restored. And so it says in Ezekiel 37 verse 14, I will put my spirit in you and you will live. When is that going to happen? It hasn't happened yet. Well, according to prophecy in the Bible, we believe that's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation. Remember, in the tribulation at the beginning, the Christians, the church is gone. And you find the book of Revelation after chapter 3, there's no more mention of the church until right at the end, but there's talk of Israel, because God starts working with Israel again. And in the middle of the tribulation, they start turning back to God in the full sense, in realizing that Jesus is the Messiah. So let's get back to our graph there. We live in the present age. Remember the birth pains. We've seen the wars. We've seen the earthquakes. We've seen the pestilences. The next thing that's going to happen on the prophetic calendar is the rapture of the church. Jesus will come back and fetch his bride. Then there's a 7-year tribulation where the Antichrist comes into power, evil man who gets his power from Satan, and he's going to first appear to be a wonderful person. He'll bring peace to the Middle East, and we know that the temple will be rebuilt, but in the middle of the tribulation, he sets up what's called the Abomination of Desolation. He sets up an image of himself in the temple, and that's when the Jews realize that this man is not the Messiah, that Jesus was the true Messiah. And so the third temple, remember I told you that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, but if you look in prophecy, it talks about the temple. It talks about the Antichrist desecrating the temple. How can you desecrate the temple if it's not there? It talks about the temple in Revelation. And yet there is no temple. So what does that tell me? According to prophecy, the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt. So there will be a third temple that will be rebuilt, because there's no temple today. Because Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 15, he said, speaking of the end times, when you see standing in the holy place, he's talking about the holy place in the temple, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. Let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So he warns them to flee. Why? Because the Antichrist is going to turn on them because they refuse to worship this image. They know according to their law, you don't bow down to a graven image, and this man cannot be the Messiah. And so when he sets up this abomination in the temple, he will then turn on them and kill those who refuse to worship his image. And Jesus tells them to flee. So we believe that there's going to be a future third Jewish temple that will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And I want to tell you, there's already organizations that are working towards that. You can go on the internet and look at the Temple Institute. Is just one of the websites that you'll find. I think it's .org. And they have already made all the instruments to be used in the temple. They've even made the altars. They've even made the clothes that the priests are going to wear. All they're waiting for is that temple to be rebuilt. Paul says that the day of the Lord will not come until the Antichrist proclaims himself to be God in the temple. So Paul also says there has to be a temple. There's no temple there at the moment. It has to be rebuilt according to prophecy. So in 2 Thessalonians, he writes to them and he tells them that they mustn't be easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way. He says that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness, that's the Antichrist, is revealed. The man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So there we know from the writing of Paul to the Thessalonians, there has to be a temple in the tribulation. It has to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. John seems to be speaking of the same event. So Jesus spoke about it. Daniel spoke about it. He called the Abomination of Desolation. Jesus used the same terms in Matthew 24. Now we see that Paul wrote about it. But John also speaks about it in Revelation 13. He talks about the false prophet, the second beast, ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. So these are all the same things. Daniel, Jesus, Paul, and John are talking about the same thing, where the Antichrist, after the temple is rebuilt, and there's this covenant peace treaty in the Middle East, but in the middle of the 7 years, he'll set up his image in the temple and proclaim that he is God and say they must worship him. So Jesus links the events in Matthew 24 to Daniel's prophecy about the abomination. Daniel speaks of the prince who is to come, which is the Antichrist, setting up the abomination in the temple and stopping the sacrifice. Daniel 9:27, in the middle of the 7, that's the 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, which we believe is that image that is spoken of in Revelation, and what Paul is talking about in Thessalonians when he says that he'll proclaim himself to be God in God's temple. And so Daniel speaks about this contemptible person who will invade the kingdom, that's Israel, when its people feel secure, and will seize it through intrigue. And he says his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. And Jesus refers to that. Some people will try to tell you, well, that already happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, Jesus, in the time of the Romans, speaks of that as still being future. Because Jesus said in Matthew 24, when you see standing in the holy place, that's the temple, the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who in Judea flee to the mountains. Why? Because the Antichrist is going to then turn on the Jews who refuse to worship him. And we see that this coincides with the Antichrist stopping the daily sacrifice in the temple, we are told in Daniel 11. So go back to our chart. Present age that we're living in with all the birth pains, the rapture where Jesus comes to fetch his church, which we know will be like a thief in the night. We won't know the day he comes. 7-year tribulation, but in the middle of it, as I told you, he sets up the abomination in the temple. The next thing that will happen at the end of the 7 years is that Jesus comes again at the second advent. Remember, this is different to the rapture. At the rapture, he comes for his church. Not everyone will see him. The church will be caught up to meet him in the air. But at the second advent, Jesus comes at Armageddon, riding on the white horse, and he comes to defend and protect Jerusalem and to set up his kingdom from Jerusalem. Now, Ezekiel 38 to 39 predicts an end-time alliance of nations who will attack Israel. We're not too sure when that takes place if we look at the book of Revelation. Some believe it's going to be at the beginning of the tribulation, at the beginning of the 7 years. There's others who say that's the same as Armageddon. There are arguments in favor of both. I don't want to go into that now. The point is, I want to mention this to you because it's very pertinent, particularly in light of what we're seeing happening in Israel at the moment. Because this invasion by Magog, it's going to happen in the future. Magog is Russia. There's a whole lot of arguments that identify Magog with Russia, but if you read in Ezekiel 38, verse 15 to 16, it speaks of Magog, who comes from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, a mighty army. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. Look at what is far north of Israel. Well, immediate north, you get Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey, but in the far north, you get Russia, and in fact, exactly due north of Jerusalem is Moscow. Yeah, that's the snapshot I took from Google Maps. You can see there's Jerusalem, and far north is Moscow. So there's going to be an end-time alliance that goes against Israel that is led by Russia. What's very interesting, though, is that Ezekiel names the allies: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah. And with the exception possibly of Gomer, we know that those nations, the modern nation equivalents of those, are all Muslim nations who hate Israel. The first one that's mentioned that's going to be the ally of Russia is Persia, which is Iran. Now, Iran are the guys who are supplying Hamas with weapons. They're the guys who are equipping them to do what they're doing, where they're trying to attack Israel. And Hezbollah as well is also armed by Iran. So Iran hates Israel. And isn't it interesting that the Bible predicts that in the end, Israel will be invaded by this coalition that is led by Russia, and one of the allies is Iran. The other one is Libya. Libya is also a Muslim nation, and again, a nation that's very anti-Israel. Put is Libya. Cush. Some people identify Cush with Ethiopia, but to be honest, it more likely corresponds to Sudan. And again, northern Sudan is a Muslim nation. The southern part, which is now a separate country, is a Christian country. But northern part of Sudan is a Muslim nation that hates Israel. And Beth Togarmah, which is another ally, is Turkey. And Turkey, although they've tried to portray themselves as being moderate, we've seen them show their true colors in the last couple of years. And again, they're becoming more and more radical Islamists. And as a result, they are not friends of Israel either. And so in the Bible, in Revelation 16, it also speaks about kings from the east coming. In Revelation 16, verse 12, it says, the sixth angel poured out his bowl in the great river Euphrates. Its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. So the great Euphrates River, this massive river that's in the Middle East, it's prophesied it will actually dry up, and these kings of the east will come through to bring their armies against Israel. Who are the kings of the east? Well, firstly, let me tell you a bit about the Euphrates. The Euphrates is a major river saying that the Euphrates will dry up is like telling the Egyptians that the Nile will dry up, because it runs out of Turkey through Syria and into Iraq, and it's a major source of water supply to all those countries there you can see. This prophecy almost seems to be unbelievable. Yeah, it's saying that the Euphrates will dry up so an army can cross it. How can this mighty river dry up? Well, it seemed impossible until 1990. And what happened is in 1990, the Turks had built a dam called the Ataturk Dam. And when they started filling up this dam, the Euphrates was temporarily stopped because they were using the water from the Euphrates. There was obviously a lot of complaint from the nations around them. But once the dam had filled, obviously the river started going again. But we saw that it was possible for the Euphrates to actually dry up. And so that prophecy that says at the time of Armageddon, the flow of the Euphrates will be dried up to facilitate the invasion of Israel, even today that's possible. With just the push of the button, you could raise the dam level and the Euphrates stops temporarily. It's only been possible since 1990. So we know that we're living in the end days. It's possible by filling up that dam, we know, to temporarily stop the flow of water in the Euphrates. So this army from the east can come. But who are these kings of the east? Many believe that it's a reference to China. More likely, it might be an alliance that includes China. So it might be different countries from Asia. But in the current political circumstance, it's quite likely it could be China. We see China allying herself with guys like Russia. So if this all refers to the same event, it's very likely that the kings of the east at least includes China coming to assist the Antichrist at Armageddon. Recent years have seen a dramatic rise in China's power and influence. They still are second to the United States in terms of economic power, but there are many predicting that that could change within the next couple of years, that ultimately China could displace the United States as the leading economic power in the world and even the leading military power. Revelation 16 verse 13, John says, I saw three evil spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are spirits of demons performing miraculous signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. So here we see at Armageddon, it's not just the kings of the east who come, but the kings of the whole world. So the whole world will ultimately turn on Israel. And we're really starting to see the signs of that today, where many countries are only included who previously supported Israel or turning against Israel. And in Psalm 2, it talks about this, where it talks of the nations conspiring and plotting in vain. The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. His anointed is Messiah. And we see that this is the same time where Jesus comes to establish his kingdom in Jerusalem, because God says, I've installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. So as these kings of the east and as the kings of the world gather against Israel, it says in Revelation 16 verse 16, they gathered together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now, Armageddon actually is a Hebrew word that literally means Har Megiddo, which means the Mount of Megiddo. So in Israel, you get the Mount of Megiddo. And right next to that mountain, there's this massive valley, the Jezreel Valley. And that valley has been the place where many battles have fought. In fact, during the past 4,000 years, there's been at least 34 bloody conflicts fought there, because this valley allows mighty armies to march through it because of the lay of the terrain. So when it speaks about Armageddon, Har Megiddo, bear in mind that's right next to the Jezreel Valley, and this is where these troops will come. And so here you can see the Jezreel Valley from the Mount of Megiddo. It measures 32 kilometers long and 11 kilometers wide. And this is where many of these armies will come in the end times to march on Jerusalem. And as I told you, there you can see the list of the many armies in the past who've gathered in that valley for mighty battles. And there's going to be one great battle at the end. The names of the warring generals who fought there, we still know today. Thutmose III, an Egyptian. Deborah and Barak, you know from your Bible. Sisera, Gideon, Saul and Jonathan, etc., up to, Vespasian, the Roman general, Saladin, the Muslim general, Napoleon, the famous French general, and Allenby, the famous British general of the 20th century, just to name the most famous. And now in his end time, the Antichrist and his armies will descend on Jerusalem. And in Daniel 8, verse 25, it says he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. So Jerusalem's actually the focus. Even though these armies march through the Jezreel Valley at Megiddo, Megiddo is 88 kilometers away from Jerusalem, and they gather there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the battle will take place there, because their ultimate destination is Jerusalem. But Jesus, we are told, will defeat the nations gathering against Jerusalem at the second advent. And he's not only going to destroy all these armies that are marching on Israel, on Jerusalem, those nations will then be judged on their fitness to enter the millennium. And at that point, the Jews are going to have realized that Jesus is a Messiah. Remember, most Jews reject Jesus as a Messiah. They're still looking for a future Messiah. And we do have Messianic Jews who believe in Jesus, but most don't. But in Zechariah 12, verse 10 to 11, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, because remember, Jesus comes to defeat these armies gathered against them, a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, the one they crucified. Remember, Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. And they will mourn for me as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. On that day, the weeping in Jerusalem will be great, like the weeping of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. See, again, Megiddo is mentioned there. Why are they going to weep? Because they're going to realize that they crucified their Messiah, who now comes back to deliver them. So, last time we should look at this chart today. The present age we live in, Jesus comes for his church, 7-year tribulation. In the middle, the Antichrist sets up his image in the temple and turns on the Jews and slaughters them. At the end of the tribulation, when the nations march against Israel, Jesus comes to liberate Jerusalem. And then finally, we're going to look at the 1,000-year millennium. After that, we also have the new heavens and the new earth. But the 1,000-year millennium is when Jesus then establishes his rule from Jerusalem, and he rules the world for 1,000 years. That's why we call it the millennium. In Latin, millennium means 1,000 years. Just a little bit about it. There's lots on this in the prophecy. Jesus is going to reign on earth, literally on earth, with righteousness and justice. We are told that we will reign with Christ on the earth for 1,000 years. So remember, we've been raptured. We come back with Jesus at the end of the tribulation, and we're going to reign with him. And we are told that there will be global peace. What a beautiful world that will be. Weapons and wars will be abolished. There you see a picture from the prophets, from Isaiah, where it talks about them beating their swords into plowshares, taking what was used for war, and they're now using it for agriculture. People will live in safety. We're told that the curse will be removed. No more curse. Sickness won't be a problem. Animal creation will be changed so as to lose its venom and ferocity. And so it speaks again in the prophets that during that period that the wolf and the lamb will lie down together. Today, the only way a wolf and a lamb lie down together is if the lamb is inside the wolf. Okay, but in the millennium, they will lie down together. And even snakes, we are told, will lose their venom. It talks about the child, the infant, playing near the nest of the adder. Longevity will be restored to those that are antediluvian. So people will again live these very long years, like we saw in Genesis, where people lived 900 years and longer. In fact, it actually says that during that time, if someone dies when they're 100 years old, they'll be considered an infant. Today, if someone lives to 100, you say, wow, that's like very long. Jews will no longer be despised. There won't be more anti-Semitism. People who hate Israel like they do today. Jesus will reign from Jerusalem. No more spiritual deception, because Satan is going to be bound for 1,000 years to keep him from deceiving the nations. And so in Revelation 20, this is what happens at the end. I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked it, sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. So there'll be no more spiritual deception when Jesus rules. Now, there are different views on the millennium. Those who believe in amillennialism, what they will say is they believe the millennium actually started at the cross. But that's 2,000 years ago. So they will say, well, it's not really 1,000 years. It just means a very long time. And they will say, we're living in the millennium now. Of course, there's a problem, because in the millennium, Satan's bound. How can Satan be bound? We see evidence of Satan causing trouble all over the world. And Peter says that Satan wanders around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he can devour. So Satan is clearly not bound, but these guys will tell you that Satan is bound symbolically and that we're already living in the millennium. We reject that type of view, amillennialism. Post-millennialism, what they say is the millennium is in the future, but they say that the church is going to convert the whole world. And once the whole world is converted, that there'll be 1,000 years of peace, and only at the end of that, Jesus will come again. Well, if you look at what's happening in the world certainly doesn't appear to be getting better and more Christian. It seems to be getting worse. In fact, Paul says to Timothy, there will be terrible times in the last days. So that's clearly not a scriptural view. So this is the view that we hold to again as premillennialists. We believe that we live in the present age. There's going to be a future 7-year tribulation. After that, the second coming of Jesus. And after that, the millennium, where Jesus himself will come and rule on earth. Amillennialists say Jesus actually stays in heaven and we actually rule on his behalf, the church. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible talks about Jesus sitting on the throne of David, which is in Jerusalem, and ruling from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. And in that time, Satan is literally bound. There's no way you can say that Satan is bound. My dad always used to say, if Satan is bound today, then the chain is too long. So let's have a quick look at judgments. There are 3 main judgments that are often confused. What are they? There's the Bema judgment, the Great White Throne. Bema is the judgment of Christians. The Great White Throne is the judgment of unbelievers. But then there's also the sheep-goat judgment, which is where the nations are judged. I told you before the millennium to judge on their fitness to enter the millennium. These are different judgments, so don't confuse them. What is the Bema judgment? Judgment of believers, spoken of in 2 Corinthians 5:10. And we believe this will happen after the rapture of the church, but before the second coming. Remember, as believers, we're going to be judged. We're not going to be judged on whether we go to heaven or hell, because the price for our sin has been paid by Jesus. But we are judged on what we have done as Christians. We will have to give an account, we are told, of what we've done since we've been born again. Only believers are judged, and we're judged for rewards. And not all will be rewarded. Some, we are told, will suffer loss, but that's a loss of reward, not a loss of salvation. And so Paul speaks about the fact that some people, as Christians, when they're born again, they build with wood, hay, and straw. And what they've done will be burned up in the day of judgment. But he says there's others who build with gold and silver. And, you know, precious precious metals, and that will survive, and those will be rewarded. So there will be a day where even as Christians, even though we are going to be with the Lord, that we are going to be judged on how we have lived. And Jesus speaks about this. Remember, the master goes, he puts his servants in charge, he gives them different talents, but when he comes back, what does he do? He judges them. He says, I gave you 3 talents, I gave you 5, I gave you 1. What did you do with them? So one day we're going to have to give an account to God of what we've done with what he's given us. What have we been given? Well, he's given you time, he's given you talents, he's given you money. How do you use it? Do you use it all for yourself, all your time for yourself, all your money for yourself, or do you use it for the kingdom of God as well? And that's what we're going to be judged on. Jesus will say, I gave you this. What did you do? Are we going to be like the servant who said, well, I just buried it and did nothing with it? And the rewards that we receive will be proportionate to our faithfulness. And we see this again and again, as I said, in the parables that Jesus told, where to some of the servants he says, well done, my good and faithful servant. And he rewards them. There's another servant that he rebukes, and he says, you wicked and lazy servant. Now, there are 5 crowns that are mentioned for believers. There's the incorruptible or imperishable crown, and it talks about that being given to those who demonstrate self-control, and they are given this incorruptible crown. It talks about the crown of rejoicing for soul winners. So if you winning souls for the Lord, which you should be in, every Christian should be doing that, you are going to be rewarded. There's a crown of life for those who persevere under trial, and for martyrs, those who are killed for the Lord, those who are persecuted. We are told, and there's the scripture references, you can go check them up, they will receive the crown of life. There's the crown of righteousness that is promised to those who long for the second coming of Jesus, those who long for the day when Jesus will come to rule and reign on earth. And then the 5th one is the crown of glory, which is promised to Christian leaders, but not just to leaders, those who serve well and in humility. Then the judgment of the nations, that takes place after Armageddon. Remember, the nations gather at Jezreel Valley by Megiddo. They're marching on Jerusalem. Jesus comes and intervenes, and Jerusalem is saved, and those nations are then judged. And that's what Jesus is speaking about when he talks about the sheep-goat judgment. When the Son of Man comes in all his glory, Matthew 25, all his angels things. No, that's not the rapture, because remember, the rapture, he comes alone. All his angels with him is the second coming, the second advent after the tribulation. He will sit on his glorious throne, where? In Jerusalem. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And it speaks of this judgment in Joel, when it says, let the nations be roused, let them advance into the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the nations on every side. Now, there is no valley today called the valley of Jehoshaphat. So we believe that's just a prophetic term that's applied to the Kidron Valley outside of Jerusalem. And there's a picture of this Kidron Valley. And because Jesus is in Jerusalem, it makes sense that that is the valley where he's going to judge the nations. We know the angels are sent out to gather the nations for judgment. The wicked are gathered, unlike the rapture where the righteous are gathered. Now, the Bema judgment of the righteous is separated by the great white throne by, well, actually 1,007 years, if you think of it, because there's a tribulation, then 1,000 years. At the end of the millennium, only then is the great white throne judgment. And so Revelation 20 says, they had not worshipped the beast, that's the Antichrist, or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. Then he says the rest of the dead, that's the wicked, did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Why? Because that's the resurrection of the righteous. Okay. The second death has no power of them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. So this is when the wicked dead are raised and they are judged. And that's not a judgment you want to be at. Because it says in verse 11 of Revelation 20, I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Each person was judged according to what they had done. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So that's not the judgment we want to be at. As Christians, as true believers, we won't be there. We'll be at the Bema judgment. The Bema judgment for rewards of the Christians. We shouldn't be at the judgment of the nations because we won't be in the tribulation. And the great white throne judgment, Christians won't have to be there as well because this is the judgment of the wicked. And we see those who don't have their names in the book of life thrown into the lake of fire. So I want to remind you as we come to a close that there are two choices and two destinies. We can either choose God's way of salvation through Jesus, or we can reject Jesus and face the consequences. And Jesus said in John 3 verse 36, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, but whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on them. So there will be no believers at that judgment, not because of our good works, but because of God's grace, because of what Jesus did on the cross, and because we've put our faith and trust in him. Not because we're not sinners, because we're all sinners, but because we are sinners who realize we are sinners and have come to God and asked him to forgive us. So there's a little table just to show you the difference between those three judgments. The Bema judgment, believers are judged. The sheep goat, the nations are judged. The great white throne, unbelievers are judged. In the Bema, we are judged for rewards. It's not whether we're going to heaven or hell, but just for rewards. Sheep goat, the nations are judged on their fitness to enter the millennium. The great white throne is a judgment for punishment for the unbelievers who've rejected Christ. The Bema one happens after the rapture. The sheep goat one happens after the tribulation, but before the millennium. And the great white throne happens at the end of the millennium, after the 1,000 years. What is the criteria of the judgment? At the Bema, we are judged based on our works as Christians. The sheep goat, they're judged based on how they treated Israel. That's why in that parable about the sheep goat, Jesus said, I was hungry and you fed me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, etc., etc. And they said, when did we do this? He said, when you did this for one of the least of these, my brothers. He's talking about the Jews. They're based on how they treated Israel. And the great white throne, they are judged based on their rejection of Christ. People who are sinners, but they're sinners who've rejected the free gift that God has given to all. And so that is the end of the module